Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randy Rich. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Pierce Atwood, where I am in the energy practice group. And I want to welcome you today to the latest in our webinar series. Today, we are discussing hydrogen's potential in New England. Not to start a hydrogen presentation with a reference to natural gas, but for those of you who know about the Natural Gas Policy Act of 1978, the NGPA. Today is the 45th anniversary of the day before the date of enactment of that law, which is the day before the date of enactment. It's an inside joke among NGPA attorneys, but that's when it all took effect. And some people view that federal law as kicking off an energy revolution. And today we're talking about another potential revolutionary change in energy, hydrogen fuel. Hydrogen, of course, is touted as a green replacement for fossil fuels in many, many applications. And it's expected to make a significant impact on New England's energy in the next decade. We are joined by two experts. Nick Salolico is an associate at Pierce Atwood in the energy group in Portland, Maine. Nick has done so much for us as a firm and as a group to help us learn about hydrogen. Prior to joining Pierce Atwood, Nick was in a small Boston energy-focused firm where he advised clients on energy regulatory and administrative matters related to solar, wind, hydro, and natural gas projects. He also advised clients on issues ranging from obtaining agency approvals for municipal financing to compliance strategies related to Massachusetts Environmental Justice Initiative. Nick also is experienced in RTO open access transmission provisions, FERC rules and procedures, and state regulatory procedures for environmental permitting. Before beginning his legal career, Nick worked as an account manager for an industrial chemical distribution company located in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and he has a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, in addition to his law degree. We also are very pleased to have Galen Nelson with us. Galen is the Chief Program Officer of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, where he oversees technology and market development programs and initiatives across the buildings, transportation, and net zero grid sectors. Galen serves as on the Mass CEC's executive team, helping the team to shape organizational strategy and direction, and he oversees the organization's emerging client finance work. Prior to this role, Galen led Mass CEC's Innovation and Industry Support Division, where he created and managed several tech-to-market and commercialization acceleration programs, including the microgrid, energy storage, and high-performance building sectors. Before joining the Mass CEC, Galen led clean energy business and green affordable housing policy and program development efforts for the city of Boston. Galen has 15 years experience developing and managing clean energy transition programs and policies at the city and state level at the intersection of urban planning, economic development, and clean energy. We're going to start today with Nick to give us some background on hydrogen and sort of set the table for Galen, talking a bit more about the potential for hydrogen here in New England, and particularly in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have a lot of participants. If you would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that, and when the speakers have finished with their presentations, we'll turn to the questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Thanks for the flattering introduction there. So, like you said, I'm just going to be providing a brief overview for those of us who aren't totally aware of what hydrogen is and what its potential is as far as the clean revolution and reaching not only United States net zero goals, but also those of the states that we all reside in. I guess I want to start by just some overview of the Department of Energy's take on what hydrogen could be doing for the United States and its role in the clean energy revolution. Next slide, please. So I just pulled this out of the DOE's Clean Hydrogen Roadmap, which was published in June 2023. As part of the Department of Energy's larger climate initiative in order to reach 2050, net zero 2050. They report that clean hydrogen can support up to 10% of economy-wide emission reductions by 2050, create 100,000 jobs. And by 2050, there's scenarios where the United States domestically could be demanding over 50 million metric tons of hydrogen. What's interesting about hydrogen in comparison to renewable energy like solar or wind is that you really have an entire supply chain that you have to create, where renewable energies, you put solar in the ground, you already have an off taker for the electricity, you already have transmission grid to get the electricity to the end user. With hydrogen, you really have to hit every single part of the supply chain. You have production, transportation, storage issues, and also creating new end uses for it. So with that, I'm going to start with production. Next slide, Abigail. So hydrogen can be produced in a number of ways, and there's a little bit of vernacular that's formed around this industry based on the type of production pathway. Right now in the United States, a large portion of the hydrogen that's produced is through steam methane reformation, where methane is taken through an industrial process and combined with steam, and you're resulting with carbon dioxide and clean hydrogen. Now, one way that you can take the hydrogen from steam methane reformation is just allow the hydrogen to the carbon dioxide to emit from that reaction, and all of a sudden you have what is considered gray hydrogen. But if you were to pair the steam methane reformation reaction and sequester the carbon dioxide that actually comes from it, that's what the industry is now referring to as blue hydrogen. On the other side, if you use electrolysis, which is you take water, H2O, and you split the hydrogen from the oxygen using electricity from renewables, you get green hydrogen. Now, these colors are starting to get a little bit of, a little out of form, so to say, due to the fact that you kind of have pathways that aren't really fitting neatly into any one of these categories. For example, if you have renewable biofuels, you might, come somewhere in between green and blue. So just take these for, these are easy reference points at this point. And then lastly, you could have pink hydrogen, which is from the curtailed nuclear generation. What we in New England probably are going to be seeing a lot of, or at least the hope of, is that as renewables penetrate the grid more, and you all of a sudden have this requirement to curtail their renewable generation, we're hopefully going to be able to take that curtailed energy and use it to produce hydrogen. And then you can use that hydrogen as a energy storage for different seasons. So kind of in comparison to batteries, where, you kind of have an intraday charge and then discharge, green hydrogen could be more along the lines of where, you have the shoulder months of September or March in New England, where you have high renewable penetration and you have this high curtailment of renewables. Take that hydrogen that you could potentially produce and store that for the winter months or the summer months. Next slide. So the next issue in the supply chain drama that hydrogen could present is transportation and storage. There's questions around whether hydrogen could be transported via the interstate pipelines, or whether it's going to be produced locally and only transported through the distribution pipelines. There's also the possibility that you could be mixing hydrogen with natural gas or whether you're going to actually really need a fully dedicated hydrogen pipeline in order to move this compound around the country. Alternatively, there's liquid organic hydrogen carriers. So essentially, you can take hydrogen and take these LOHCs, as they're referred to, and infuse them where they absorb the hydrogen readily and they also release the hydrogen readily. And the way that I like to think of LOHCs is they're kind of like blood cells with oxygen, where you breathe in, you get oxygen in your blood cells, and it takes it to the parts of your body that needs it. Alternatively to hydrogen carriers or in the pipelines, there's also the possibility that hydrogen could have a huge potential to be transported via truck, via tube trailers. So that would generally happen via compressed hydrogen at extremely high pressures, which could possibly require, new safety regulations for highways, just thinking from that point of view. And then lastly, just to go over the last 2 points on this slide, hydrogen probably will be stored via on-site tanks. Let's say that if you have a peaker plant or something like that sort, and you want to use hydrogen as to combust, you might want an on-site tank for that. In other parts of the country where this is more common, is there's salt caverns where essentially the hydrogen is pumped underground and stored in these giant cavernous caves at basically 1 atmosphere. So it's kind of a developing industry, but as you'll see in the next few slides, all of these things are evolving at the same time. Next slide, Abigail. So one thing that's interesting about hydrogen is there's a fair amount of end use applications for it. Hydrogen is similar to natural gas in the sense that it can be combusted, but where it's dissimilar is the fact that hydrogen, when it's combusted, the only byproducts are water. So you no longer have any of that carbon dioxide that's leading to high emissions. So there's this potential for blending hydrogen into natural gas supplies and using that blend to power natural gas power plants in the interim. That will hopefully lead to incremental decreases in carbon dioxide emissions. Alternatively, there's a possibility for residential uses as well. For example, National Grid, in an investigation with the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts, submitted a 2050 roadmap. And as part of that roadmap, it opined that there's a possibility that its natural gas distribution grid will be using a 20% green hydrogen blend along with renewable natural gas by 2040. As an alternative to combustion, there's also fuel cells. Where combustion, you're actually igniting hydrogen. Fuel cells are a chemical reaction where hydrogen and oxygen are combined, and one of the byproducts is electricity. You'll probably see this a lot more with heavy duty vehicles, things like 18-wheelers, long haul vehicles. You could also see it with medium-sized power plants, things that are 1 to 30 megawatts in size, potentially helping with peak demand. And then also, if you have industrial facilities that need forklifts and things that need to be refueled immediately that you can't allow them to charge all the time, hydrogen could come into play there. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on was using hydrogen as a feedstock for other fuels, such as ammonia, as I noted here, where ammonia could ultimately be used as a combustible fuel for cargo or for cargo ships or other sorts of things. It's also worth noting that ammonia has a readily available market, so it could help spur financial interest in it, investing in hydrogen, because ammonia is used readily as a fertilizer. So if it's just another way to kind of stimulate the market for hydrogen production. Next slide. So I wanted to note some important developments when it comes to hydrogen. From a federal standpoint, there's a lot of federal incentives for the production and research and the use of hydrogen nationally. The bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in 2021 had a ton of incentives for hydrogen. The Inflation Reduction Act allows for a production tax credit for hydrogen. What's interesting about the production tax credit is it's linked to the carbon intensity of the production of the hydrogen itself. So arguably, if you produce the hydrogen using renewables, so solar, and you use that curtailed electricity, there won't be any carbon emissions associated with the manufacture of that hydrogen. So you'll be able to receive the highest amount of credit. Another interesting fact about the Inflation Reduction Act is that you can kind of stack these credits. So some people on this call might know, if you have a renewable generation facility like a solar facility or a wind facility, you can currently use a Section 48 credit, investment tax credit, or a 45 production tax credit. So you could be producing electricity from a facility that's already received, say, 30% in investment tax credits, take that electricity, produce the hydrogen, and then once again receive a production tax credit for the hydrogen. So it's really trying to make it economical to start producing really clean hydrogen. There's other tax credits that are available from the Inflation Reduction Act, such as for alternative fuel refueling property, which is a mouthful. Often people think about these as electric charging stations, but there's actually provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that allow for biofuels and alternatively hydrogen. So if there's ever an uptick in hydrogen vehicle production and people are actually going to need hydrogen fueling stations, what the Inflation Reduction Act does is it allows for a $100,000 tax credit for each fueling station that you put in place. Like I mentioned before, LDCs in Massachusetts have already submitted plans to start blending hydrogen with their distribution systems. And I wanted to make this a little bit more salient, so I kind of included the fact that Connecticut has a power plant down in New Britain that actually uses hydrogen fuel cell technology, and the total capacity of the power plant is 20 megawatts, and they're using Bloom technology hydrogen fuel cells. And lastly, unfortunately, while Northeast Hub wasn't selected, the Department of Energy has selected hydrogen hubs, 7 hubs in total around the country, awarding $7 billion in funding. So that's just to evidence the financial push that the United States is really putting towards hydrogen production and research and also end use. Next slide, Alga. And this is the last substantive slide that I have, and I just wanted to name some of the issues with hydrogen and things that kind of red flags when it comes to hydrogen. One thing that's notable about hydrogen is that it's more volatile than natural gas, meaning there can be less hydrogen in a certain volume and it'll still combust. So if you had an open flame, let's say natural gas combusts at 50%, needs 50% of the air around it. With hydrogen, you only have 20% of the air around you and it can combust. So super dangerous compound from that standpoint. It's also very tough to odorize. So as we all know, with our natural gas stoves, if you live in New England, if you leave the stove on, you'll end up smelling that before if there's any issues. With hydrogen, they really haven't figured out a way to have a odor combined with it, so that you know that the silent and scentless compound is actually rising right around you. Another issue is the fact that hydrogen is simply smaller than methane. So when you put it into a pipeline, there's going to be more losses when you transport it. There's leaks in the pipeline already. This is definitely going to exacerbate it if you put hydrogen in there, even at smaller blends. When it comes to interstate pipelines, which are generally made out of steel, hydrogen can actually lead to hydrogen embrittlement, which compromises the structural integrity of these pipelines and shorten their lifespan. So that raises issues of whether A, the United States is going to allow for a blend of hydrogen in interstate travel, and B, whether these pipelines are actually going to want to are going to want to retrofit their pipelines in order for interstate transport of hydrogen. As far as these last 2 points, when it comes to hydrogen combustion, especially when you're to say have an existing natural gas plant, there's really a public perception issue where it's just so similar to natural gas that folks just view it as a fossil fuel, even though it isn't necessarily carbon emitting. Just the fact that, you know, you're actually burning something, it does seem like it's bad for the environment. So that's another hurdle that hydrogen is going to have to overcome. And then lastly, hydrogen is a very light compound, H2 at least. So it's not volumetrically energy dense, meaning you can't really take a lot of hydrogen and put it in and use it for, let's say, like airplanes or something of that without taking up a really large volume. So it's another hurdle that the industry is going to have to overcome. Next slide, Abigail. And so we're going to be making this slideshow available at the end of this webinar. And so I just wanted to include a few helpful links. Like I mentioned earlier, the United States issued the Clean Hydrogen Roadmap. I mentioned some safety concerns, and for all of you that might be thinking about using hydrogen in the future, there's a link to the Center for Hydrogen Safety. And the last thing that I linked to is the Intermountain Power Project out in Utah, where they're going to be using a natural gas power plant that's going to initially use a blend of hydrogen and natural gas, but eventually use 100% hydrogen by 2045 to have 1,800 megawatts of capacity in the future. And that's going to be paired with a salt dome storage facility near the power plant. So you're going to be seeing all of the things that I mentioned earlier in the slides all kind of coming together. And we're going to need more projects like that and undertakings in order to get this industry off the ground. So you got to give credit where credit is due there. And I believe that's the end of the slideshow, but next slide. Yeah. And I guess I'll turn it over to Randy and Galen from here.
Thanks, Nick. I think now we'll hear from Galen Nelson. Please, Galen, proceed.
Great. Thanks, Randy. Thanks for including me in this discussion, and thanks, Nick, for that overview. I don't need to do the Hydrogen 101 anymore, so really appreciate that. And as Randy noted, we'll certainly be available for some questions when I'm done. So I would just say, I think, Randy, you have some questions for me, but I would just say at a high level that the kind of views and the remarks, that have a bit of a disclaimer, the views and remarks that I'm sharing today are somewhat provisional in the sense that we have launched a hydrogen policy and market development roadmap process with at the Department of Energy Resources here in the Commonwealth. And that will certainly help further inform our views with regard to the role that clean hydrogen will play in the state's clean energy future. But it's also worth noting that the state does have some history exploring what that role might be. Hydrogen is covered in the state's decarbonization roadmap that was published several years ago. The easiest way to characterize, and we'll get into a little bit more detail later, but the easiest way to characterize the role that that we believe hydrogen will play in the state's clean energy future is a very strategic, but also a very targeted role. And, you know, we've spent the last probably 12 to 18 months, in part due to the Hydrogen Hub funding opportunity that Nick referenced, really taking a hard look at hydrogen. To be clear, the Mass Clean Energy Center has supported early stage hydrogen technology developers, companies that are developing new electrolyzer technologies and so on, for over a decade. But this is our first effort to kind of step into the market development space. We're actually thinking about standing up a market similar to the efforts that we took with regard to building a market around energy storage or for energy storage several years ago. So again, my views and like those of my colleagues are somewhat provisional. They may evolve as we move forward with this roadmap development process. But I'm also understanding of the market and of hydrogen and its applications as somewhat mature at this stage. So that's the context in which I'm offering on it. So Randy, would you like me to just kind of continue to talk about our role, or do you want to, would you like to pose questions? How would you like to move forward with it?
Yes, absolutely. Please do. Don't wait for my questions.
Okay.
We're
All right, great.
we want to focus on questions from the audience, and mine were just in case.
Sure. No, absolutely. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about, I will touch on the hydrogen hub. That was certainly a disappointment, as Nick noted accurately. We worked very closely with our partners in the Northeast, in an effort anchored by our friends and colleagues at NYSERDA, but including clean energy and economic development agencies from almost every New England state, as well as, again, New York and New Jersey, in an effort that was ultimately unsuccessful. But I will say that the outcome of that effort to put together an application to DOE's hydrogen funding opportunity really was a forcing factor, and I think has helped focus many of the states, including Massachusetts, on this nascent market and what we need to do to stimulate more investment and market activity and project development. So it was a forcing factor, and I think in a very helpful way. I'd also add that the partnerships that were developed as a result of the hub funding opportunity will endure, and our coordination and collaboration and communication with our partners at the state level and the region continue. And I think that's going to be very helpful because for some of the reasons that Nick, I think, well described, standing up an entirely new market is something that is certainly very helpful to have support from the federal government. But notwithstanding that support, at least in the short term, it's extremely helpful and I think easier to build a regional market for clean hydrogen than it would be for any state to undertake that on its own. So that's what I'd say with regard to the hydrogen funding opportunity. I will echo some of what Nick described as the clean hydrogen applications and uses that we find, at least initially, more attractive. There are certainly some, it's important to underscore, that we're not interested in supporting. I would say at a high level that we're very interested in clean hydrogen applications that complement the state's electrify everything strategy. Far and away, the vast majority of end-use demand, for the vast majority of end-use demand, electrification is the most efficient pathway and offers the easiest and most cost-effective path to decarbonization and ultimately meeting the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. I would particularly point to building space heating, which has gotten a lot of attention, and will underscore that a multitude of studies have found that even using clean hydrogen for that purpose really makes no sense and is at odds with our greenhouse gas reduction objectives, in part because using heat pumps is just so much more efficient, and because the Healy administration is not interested in injecting hydrogen into the natural gas system, both because we don't think it makes sense to heat buildings through hydrogen combustion, nor does it make sense to extend the life of a major piece of energy infrastructure that we're slowly but surely moving away from, which is the natural gas system. That said, and we can perhaps get more into this, I don't think we've ruled out very targeted, kind of bespoke hydrogen-only pipe distribution systems, nor would we certainly wouldn't rule out on-site storage for hydrogen combustion for certain building heating needs for certain things like hospitals. So I wouldn't want to say it's a kind of an out and out rejection of use of hydrogen for combustion for space heating. That there may be some exceptions, but by and large, we find, and many others have found, looking at this, that it really does not make sense to use hydrogen for that purpose. That said, again, echoing Nick, there are a variety of applications where hydrogen may not only be necessary, but superior to electrification. Again, both practically and from a cost perspective, and also in other situations where we simply may need more flexibility with regard to our energy needs, particularly during times of year when supply may be constrained or very expensive, of course, with fuel aligned. And so, somewhat repeating Nick's list, those include heavy industrial loads, including high temperature process loads, some transportation applications, certainly some heavy duty and perhaps even some medium duty vehicles. And I would just remark there that the applicability doesn't necessarily turn on the vehicle class, although that's important, but it also depends on the duty cycle of that vehicle. Is it a type of vehicle that needs to run for a very long time with very few opportunities for recharging, where a battery electric system would simply not be practical or too costly? So some public bus routes might make sense, for example, although electrification of public transit buses probably makes sense for most buses in most duty cycles. So that on the vehicle side, certainly some vessel and marine applications, and there it may be, as Nick noted, via ammonia produced from green hydrogen, so an e-fuel application there, a peaking and storage resource. Nick mentioned the project in Connecticut, which I wasn't familiar with. I am familiar with a peaker plant in New York. I believe it's a NYPA asset that is running in part on hydrogen. So that's certainly something that we would need to look at. I know our decarbonization roadmap study here in the Commonwealth contemplated with a net zero, even with a net zero target by 2050, that we still may have peaking resources. I think at the time we were contemplating natural gas fired peaking resources in the out years, and that's certainly still a possibility. It would be silly to speculate that far ahead, but perhaps those are hydrogen fired peaking resources or a blend of natural gas and hydrogen. Again, too early to know or to rule those out. And then ground service equipment, special equipment, similar to the vehicle, the narrative with regard to medium and heavy duty trucks. There may be certain types of construction and other equipment where hydrogen simply is a better fit than electrification. So those are some of the applications that I think we're very interested in exploring more deeply with this roadmap that I referenced at the beginning of my remarks that we're launching in partnership with the Department of Energy. And perhaps that's a good time to talk a little bit more about what that roadmap will include. We'll certainly, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We'll certainly be referencing the U.S. Department of Energy's hydrogen roadmap, which has a lot of great content, much of which will be applicable to our efforts here in the Commonwealth. But we'll certainly want to look at and focus more attention on clean hydrogen production approaches and to better understand what makes sense given our energy mix. We'll certainly want to take a harder look at all of the applications that I've just walked through, potential applications for clean hydrogen, We certainly want to think about the regulatory side with regard to storage, with regard to transportation and distribution of hydrogen, whether that be via truck or via pipeline, and then think about a range of other environmental and human health, from noise related to hydrogen production to pollution and so on. So the roadmap will explore and safety issues as well. So the roadmap will explore a wide variety of concerns and help inform the state's next steps with regard to, again, stimulating some early investment in hydrogen projects. Maybe I'll just add a few more remarks, and then perhaps we can shift to questions. Of course, and Nick got into this a little bit, there are obviously two important sides of hydrogen. There's the production of hydrogen that we need to be concerned with, and then the use. And the color kind of scheme or analogy that Nick described is certainly one that is still referenced broadly. I think what we're also seeing, and I think are interested in better understanding, and I think provides an opportunity for a little bit more nuance, is to talk about hydrogen in terms of its carbon intensity. So, and I mention that because I think we need to recognize the fact that in order to grow any new clean energy market, there is going to be a time when we may need to ensure that we're not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, which is to say that we're going to need to grow demand for clean hydrogen. It's a chicken or the egg challenge that is discussed far and wide, which is why the U.S. Department of Energy is focused on both the 45V, the production tax credit for hydrogen, and why DOE is also contemplating a demand side incentive, which the structure and contours of which are far less clear at this point. But I would say that there's broad agreement and excitement around this concept, particularly within the hub partners, as we see that as a critical complement to 45V. We need to both stimulate the production of clean hydrogen, and we need to stimulate demand. And of course, that's in large measure what the opportunity was designed to do. So we'll be taking a harder look at that, but I just wanted to kind of reassure everyone that we are certainly focusing our energy and resources on low carbon intensity hydrogen, which may mean hydrogen produced with grid power at times when the carbon intensity of the grid is very low. That may make sense for the short to medium term to build a pipeline, a figurative pipeline of clean, low carbon hydrogen. As we move forward in the outer years, it may make sense to move to a more stringent standard to ensure that the hydrogen that we're using is cleaner, and that ultimately use where that clean hydrogen is deployed actually contributes and does not detract from the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets. So perhaps I'll stop there, and we'd be to take questions or dig more deeply into any of the other things that I discussed, or perhaps that Nick touched on.
Thank you, Galen. That's very enlightening. And we do have some questions from the audience. I'll start with one from our friend Pete White at Woodland Pulp. Is there a loss of efficiency when creating hydrogen from electricity? I know this is an issue for ethanol created from corn, which takes pretty large quantities of natural gas to create. So are we looking at the same issue for hydrogen?
Sure, and I think that's particularly why and I tried not to kind of wade too deeply into the 45V debate, which is very hot. And perhaps I revealed a little bit of where I come down personally. I do think we should have a fairly strong standard with regard to clean hydrogen production. I do wonder whether or not all of the proposed prongs of 45V may be so stringent such that it makes it very difficult to launch the market. That said, yes, there are absolutely efficiency losses, which is why one of the many reasons why those who support a more stringent standard believe that hydrogen production via electrolysis should be linked to new and clean renewable resources. So with even with a combined cycle fossil fuel plant, you've got about a 50% efficiency. I think some of our best electrolyzers hover around 70%. So you're already looking at substantial losses. And I think the promise of integrating clean hydrogen into our clean energy future is that we're doing so in regions or at a time when we have substantial and even excess renewables that can be dedicated to hydrogen production, given those efficiency losses, and then applied to uses that are very hard or not cost effective. That, to me, is generally the pathway that we should be following, and I think many share that view. I think you can argue around the edges about how exactly we get there and how stringent we should be, but I think that's generally where we need to be headed, because yes, there are losses with regard to hydrogen production, even with our best electrolyzers, and even on a grid that is relatively clean, like the grid in ISO.
But even with those losses, Galen, if you're using hydrogen to replace a fuel that has a higher level of greenhouse gas emissions, then in the balance, the losses may be worth it, right?
So they may be worth it, or they may be worse.
Well, they may be. It may be worthwhile to absorb those inefficiencies in order to have fewer emissions.
Yeah, and I also think we have to be practical and again think about flexibility, right? There may be supply challenges. I think we do need to have options with regard to our low carbon energy future. So there may be times of the year or times of the day when it might make sense to use different fuels in different contexts. So again, this is why the word transition is in the phrase energy transition. That a lot of this will evolve over the next 30 years, and I don't think we're going to be to kind of a clean energy, very low carbon economy steady state until the outer years, so the late 2040s to 2050, and we'll learn a lot along.
So since you mentioned supply challenges, with the closest hydrogen hub potentially being in the Mid-Atlantic region in Delaware, does that pose any particular challenges for Massachusetts and New England? Will hydrogen be able to be transported from that clean energy hub, or perhaps the one in Pennsylvania, to New England, whether by truck or pipeline or however? And if not, what can we do to encourage private development in New England and Massachusetts?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Randy, and I think that's so. I'll try not to sound like I'm punting on that one too much, but I think that is part of what this hydrogen roadmap, market and policy development roadmap that we're funding and moving forward on will help determine, right? In the absence of this hub funding, what are the steps that the state should take in order to develop even a very modest supply of low carbon or clean hydrogen and then pair that with, again, with projects that include applications, uses that are aligned with the state's climate objectives. I will say that, there are about, as far as I'm aware, 1,600 miles of hydrogen-only pipeline, a dedicated hydrogen pipeline in this country, mostly in the South and Louisiana and Texas, and perhaps surrounding states. So I'm certainly not going to speculate on whether or not clean hydrogen that we anticipate will be produced by another hub or another region, whether or not that could be here. But I think that the industry has certainly demonstrated that they can and do safely transport hydrogen via pipe across state lines in other parts of the country. But I think it's too early to kind of speculate beyond that how we meet those objectives.
And and putting the hydrogen hubs aside, there's always the potential for additional loans or loan guarantees or grants, whether it's from the U.S. Department of Energy or from different state energy agencies that would encourage some development at some scale, in particular states.
True. I think there's both. There are financing opportunities. I think the question that many states, including Massachusetts, will face, with or without hub funding, is if and whether states should contemplate clean hydrogen production incentives, right, above and beyond the federal incentive. We don't, to be clear, we do not have a view on that yet. That's again something that I hope we'll explore. But I think I do know that that is a question that many states that are leading on finance and that are interested in better understanding what role hydrogen will play in their futures. That is a question that they're contemplating.
Nick, I don't know, you and I had talked before. I don't know if you have a question for Galen that you want to ask.
Yeah. So you've referenced and I've referenced the fact that you're going to need large amounts of renewable penetration probably before you're going to have a lot of hydrogen being produced in the region. If offshore wind is delayed in any respects, how do you think that that's going to affect hydrogen production in the Commonwealth?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of that, Nick. If what is delayed?
Offshore wind development.
Oh, if offshore wind development, yeah. And thank you for raising that. I probably remiss in not mentioning that, of course, one of our most promising new clean energy resources is offshore wind, and there's a lot of discussion around the extent to which it makes sense to pair offshore wind both with long duration energy storage for a variety of reasons, because it firms that effectively firms that resource, and with hydrogen production. So it is disappointing. Of course, I hope that our offshore wind projects move forward. In discussing the challenges in that market with my colleagues on our offshore wind team here at MassEC, who I think have been working to grow this market for a very long time. I'm going all the way back to developing the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal here in Massachusetts, which serves as the staging ground for some of the first offshore wind projects that will provide clean electricity to the state. I think we need to view the setbacks that we're seeing right now as temporary, and it's my hope, and I think it's one that's shared broadly throughout the administration, that these projects will ultimately move forward. And there may be some changes to contracts, and there may be some unfortunate delays, but these projects will move forward, and I do think that there is a synergy between again this new clean energy resource in offshore wind and the potential to produce some amount of clean hydrogen that can again meet these very targeted needs.
But I guess one theory would be that the more that you could get out of wind. In other words, not just storage when the grid is not using the power generated by wind, because wind blows when it blows. You could a hydrolyzer could perform that same function of taking that excess power and putting it to use by creating hydrogen and getting, again, a higher load factor, I guess, to use an old term, use for the wind power.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is precisely why people are interested in powering that resource.
Let me change course just a little bit. If there's going to be a hydrogen production facility or storage facility of any scale, isn't it going to face some of the same siting issues that are raised for other energy projects, whether it's fossil fuel, battery storage, solar, wind, of course, and how can the Commonwealth and other states help overcome that and encourage development of hydrogen as opposed to having to increase the cost by dealing with all the siting issues that we've seen in the energy industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you point to a real challenge. I think not just facing Massachusetts with regard to energy infrastructure, and I would add that goes beyond just even clean energy production, but also includes energy storage, so citing batteries, and even into our very necessary distribution system and transmission infrastructure, so substations and the like. There's no doubt that we need to build a lot to meet our climate objectives if we're to electrify all end users. And I'm very happy that the Healy administration has launched, I think, a very important effort to focus attention on siting and permitting challenges, and that is the long-winded Energy Infrastructure Siting and Planning Commission. I can't believe I was able to remember all that. I'm part of a kind of an interagency group supporting that commission. I've certainly flagged for the kind of commission leadership that hydrogen infrastructure needs to be in scope with this discussion for precisely the reasons you raised. I do see a question here about some of the perception issues. Yes, there are concerns around, I think, the reasonable concerns around hydrogen combustion. It is certainly superior to natural gas combustion on a variety of metrics, in particular particulate matter, which is a major trigger for some very serious human health conditions, including asthma and heart disease. But there are certainly some pollution from hydrogen combustion. Of course, fuel cell use is entirely clean. So yes, that needs to be part of the conversation. There are concerns about hydrogen safety. I think that those should be taken as seriously as we take concerns around natural gas safety. And it is a well understood fuel, and it is safely transported and stored and that should certainly be part of the narrative. But it is as Nick noted, that's the reason why it's number one on the periodic table. It is an extremely small molecule, and it will leak through the pipe networks that we have now, which is yet another reason why blending it into the existing system makes little sense.
Yeah, I think you touched on this, but certainly a lot of people in the natural gas industry were surprised when a pipeline compressor station was sited in a clearly industrial property next to a power plant. But in the years since that power plant was built, there were environmental justice communities that grew up in that area and that were disadvantaged, and as you said, subject to asthma and other things that we see from emissions. So, it seems to me a lot of the natural place to cite these things, cite the electrolyzers, are where we already have power plants, or as you mentioned, the New Bedford docks where the wind power is going to come ashore.
Right.
So it's still going to be probably a difficult problem.
It is, and I think this is a very, as I noted, I'm very happy that the administration has launched this commitment, but I don't think it can or will end there. I think that this is going to be a long education process to help not just residents of Massachusetts, but residents across the country. That the energy transition is going to involve building a lot of new energy. Some of it new and unrecognizable energy infrastructure. And if we're to achieve our electrification objectives, we're going to have to make dramatic investments in the grid. So I think we have a long way to go with regard to, and I think it does need to be a partnership. I'm seeing in the question, what can industry do to help? I think that's right. I think this is a perfect example of a public-private partnership where you need ad campaigns. You need to engage the public about both the benefits of electrification and clean fuels like hydrogen. People should know that the public transit buses passing through the neighborhoods are now generating no emissions. But they also need to understand that in order to install the charging infrastructure for that bus depot, for example, might involve a significant increase in the service equipment at that location. We can't entertain magical thinking. I think we need to be honest with people about what these investments will require, but also what the benefits will bring. And in some cases, those benefits are significant and in fact, life-giving benefits.
Yeah, I agree. I think education is key. I think that people need to be helped to understand these new technologies that they're not familiar with, and to not be afraid of hydrogen. It comes from water. Yes, it's volatile when it's, but not when it's water. But as I said last week on our natural gas webinar, we have to trust science. And I mean, last week I was making the point that you have to trust science from both perspectives. You have to believe in climate change, but you also have to have some belief that perhaps science can make natural gas more usable and capture carbon or otherwise reduce emissions. And the same thing, I think, applies to educating people on hydrogen, and also that science may find even better ways to manufacture hydrogen, whether it's using less electricity to manufacture more hydrogen, or things that no one's even thought about yet that could certainly happen in the next 10 to 20 years. Based on what we've seen in the last 10 years, there's no reason to expect that science can't continue that.
And in fact, we're seeing that, right? And those are some of the more exciting innovations that we're seeing here in Massachusetts. It's true that our region, particularly Massachusetts and Connecticut, are very strong with regard to electrolyzer and fuel cell technology development. And we've been very proud to support some of those emerging Massachusetts companies. And you're right, that those technologies will improve over time. So that might be a way to kind of bring this to closure, both on that kind of hopeful note, but also with regard to leaning into science. That is why we've launched this roadmap process. We want to make sure that the state's approach to hydrogen, our clean hydrogen future, our clean energy future in general, is grounded in science. That's why we launched this roadmap effort. And that will be moving forward over the next 6 to 12 months. And we've already begun a wide variety of stakeholder engagement on that, and we'll continue to do that. So I'm happy to have folks reach out to me or other members of my team who are working in hydrogen and address your questions.
I want to again thank Galen and Nick and thank all of our participants. We hope you enjoyed this fascinating discussion. I just, again, as someone who loves science, this is just fascinating to me, and I hope it is to you. It's certainly going to be very, very important in the energy and environmental space, not only in New England but throughout the country and throughout the world, I think. And Galen, I hope we can do this again in a year and hear about even more advances. So with that, I will thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next discussion, our next webinar in December, which will deal with an update on the IRA. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Nick.